Hello and welcome. Today we have Simon Pressley, an independent property market analyst. We're excited to have him here to talk about the Australian economy, direction of the property market, and of course, interest rates, which is a hot topic at the moment. So starting off on interest rates, and let's talk about a controversial article you wrote earlier in the year saying Australian house prices could still double even with interest rate rises.
There are lots and lots of pieces to the property jigsaw puzzle, and interest rates are just one of those. And what we have said is drawn on evidence and said, let's look at Australian history and other times when interest rates have gone up, because they go up all the time. They just haven't gone up in this country for about 11 years, and people have forgotten that. So what we have said is there's a heap of evidence when property markets have done, not only have gone up, but the single biggest boom in Australian history. So this country is roughly 230 years of age. The biggest boom over those 230 years was a 6-year window between 2002 and 2008. In that 6-year period of time, the standard variable rate home loans started that 6-year period at 6.5%. They went up 22 times over the following 6 years, and they ended at 9.5%. Over that 6-year period of time, 6 out of 8 capital cities saw their median house price at least double. At least. The softest of our 8 capital cities was Sydney and Melbourne. And among our 200 individual regional towns and cities, they did even better than those 6 capital cities that more than doubled. So I think what a lot of people do is, I call it the metric of the moment. Whenever there's something topical that's going to have an impact on property prices, if that's something, in this case it's interest rates, if it's going to not have a positive influence, the experts of the world gravitate to that one thing and go, well, because that one thing is not going to have a positive influence, therefore prices will decline. What they never do is make a balance assessment and say, well, that one thing is not going to have a positive influence, but what are all the other things that now and always have a positive influence? So if the one thing is negative, in this way, rising interest rates means the interest expense of the household will increase. That's not a positive influence, so they say it will go down. Let's have a look at the last 2 years. When COVID first hit Australia, we closed our international border, and all these so-called experts, again, the worst of them are the economists and the banks, every single one of them said property prices will not only decline, it could be the single biggest decline in real estate that this country's ever seen because we won't have any population growth. So back then, it's only 2 years ago, back then the one metric of the moment was population growth. Then you fast forward 6 years from that, and the one metric of the moment was JobKeeper. When there was we've had this great support policy, we're going to take that away soon. And the same, I call them lemon suckers because they can never see positive in anything. The lemon suckers gone, oh, well, when they remove JobKeeper, like no one's going to be able to pay their mortgage, property prices will decline. And then 6 months after that, it was the loan deferral scheme. So some people during COVID who now lost their job or on stand down or whatever had the option of contacting their bank and say, can you please pause my repayments? That was what was called the loan deferral scheme. So the next metric of the moment was, oh, well, when they take that policy away, what's going to happen? There's going to be all these distressed sales, property prices will crash. Didn't happen. And now that one metric, or there's probably two metrics at the moment, inflation and interest rates. So because they'll have a negative influence or what we call a dragging effect, people automatically jump to conclusions and go, well, property prices will decline. The other thing that everyone needs to be aware of if you've got an interest in property markets is that the commentary now and always will always be dominated by Sydney and Melbourne. About 95% of our media representatives live in those two big cities. And so whatever's happening, again, now and always, whatever's happening in property markets in those two cities will get reported as if that's what's happening right across Australia. So if we go back to 2013 to 2017, when Sydney and Melbourne's markets had a boom, nowhere else in Australia had a boom, but it was reported Australia's booming. Brisbane was dead flat, Adelaide was dead flat, Perth and Darwin were going backwards. But it was reported Australia's having this boom. 2017 to 2019, Sydney and Melbourne had a significant property market downturn. It was reported as if we got this massive national property market downturn. Hobart was booming. Brisbane and Adelaide were having some modest growth. Large parts of regional Australia were starting to really, really crank up. but reported as a national downturn. Right here, right now, Sydney and Melbourne have started to see a decline in property values. So that's been reported that all of Australia property prices are going down, and we expect that because interest rates are going up. Large parts of Australia will produce double-digit growth this year, mark my words.
You know, a couple of years ago, you put it out there that maybe the property market wasn't going to crash going to COVID. And, you know, even in this video, we're going to go through a couple other views on what you're seeing moving forward. But, you know, how did you kind of get that right, I guess, back then? What did you see and how did you prove some of those other experts wrong?
Yeah, well, I mean, analysing property markets literally all over Australia is my full-time profession. Yes, it's quite often that what we're saying at any given point in time, Jaden, is quite often opposite to what the mainstream is saying. We're not on a mission to be contrarian. It just often we have a different view to others. But what I will say is the others that society puts up on a pedestal as an expert, none of them, and especially the banks and the economists who society calls the expert, none of them have studied Australian real estate history. So they're actually not experts. That said, we'll never always be right. I've often argued there's nothing more complicated on this planet than understanding property markets. There's so many moving pieces to the puzzle is sort of how I describe it. But at its core, anticipating future market performance, we need to understand the relationship between buyers and sellers. A lot of people, they hear the term supply and demand. And this is particularly the economists who are guilty here. They think demand is population growth. It's not. And they think supply is adding up all the number of dwellings across the country. It's not. They are part of the equation, but in the overall scheme of things, it's a very small portion of the equation. Now, how do I know that? Well, from devoting years and years and years of my life to studying what's happened in every location in Australia historically, and then digging deeper. And when we isolate individual years that, you know, certain locations had booms in these years and they had downturns in other years, digging deeper and understanding, well, what actually happened in those cities in those years, and coming up with what we call the common denominators. So it's learning from history what causes booms, what causes downturns, what causes modest performance. And then, you know, now and every other year going forward, looking at those characteristics and making an educated assessment as to how things might unfold going forward. Long answer, but property is very complicated.
Yeah. Well, and I guess you kind of touched on it just before as some of the sort of positive influence and some of the stuff that can kind of slow down the property market. You kind of categorize it as like sort of drag because, you know, the sort of interest rates and then this kind of lift from, you know, potentially migration and different things. So I guess what are some things that you look out for moving forward that could contribute to that double-digit growth that you mentioned just then?
Yeah, so the dragging effect of interest rates, what it will do, it's predominantly affecting psychology. And I blame digital media for this. Digital media is great for a lot of good things, but it also makes things out to be a lot worse than what they are, because we've got our, you know, iPhone or iPad in our hand pretty much 24/7. And everyone's a journalist these days, not just the official journalist, but everyone's got their own Twitter account, our Facebook, you know, YouTube channels, whatever. So they're all a journalist and they all spit out their own stuff. And so therefore we read more information than what we would have. Unfortunately, it's poor quality information. But nonetheless, if you're reading the same thing over and over and over and over again, and that one thing is negative rather than positive, if you're not aware of it and you don't take the time to form your own educated opinion, which most people don't, then you just assume that, you know, because everyone's saying this, that something's bad is going to happen. So, but the fundamentals of Australian property markets have not changed. They are just as strong now as what they were, you know, just before Christmas. The only tangible change is we've had 2 interest rate increases. But specific to interest rates, how does it affect people? Well, it affects household budgets. But almost everybody with a mortgage will not actually feel anything at all, even though interest rates have gone up twice in the last 2 months. Why this happens is no one likes being in debt, Jaden, any longer than what we need to. When we first acquire that mortgage, let's picture, so 95% of people with a home today, their mortgage repayment they're paying now is the same as what they were paying 5 years ago. So what they did is they said, okay, my bank says I must pay a minimum of $2,000 a month or whatever it is. I don't want to be paying my mortgage off still and I'm old and grey, I can afford to pay $2,500 per month or whatever it is, right? So they set their household budget, they lock in a direct debit and they pay $2,500 per month, more than what they need to. Then when we got to 3 years ago, the RBA first started to cut interest rates. So this was about 6 months before COVID. But the direct debit is still established at $2,500 per month because that's what the person can afford, and it's in their interest to continue to pay that. They haven't had a reduction in salary, so they continue to do that. The bank charges them less interest each month because the RBA has cut interest rates. So all it means is the repayment hasn't changed, but they're paying more off the principal instead of off the interest. Now, we end up having about 6 or 7 RBA cuts. So we've enjoyed 3 years of paying off our debt much quicker because of those RBA cuts. Now we're seeing the reverse of that cycle. I think the RBA, and I support what they're doing, the RBA is in a hurry to, as quick as they can, because we've got such a strong economy, to get interest rates back to somewhere near where they were 3 years ago. Which, by the way, 3 years ago, we had an official national mortgage arrears percentage of 1%. 1%. We'll end up with interest rates somewhere around that. So as the RBA starts cranking up interest rates, the household budget hasn't changed. We've still got that direct debit set at $2,500 per month or whatever it is. So they're not going to feel this at all. What's been affected is the psyche. We're reading this material. Oh, this can't be good on property prices. Think about the practicalities of your own life as I've just described it there. Now, here's another official statistic from the RBA themselves. They published this in October last year, a report on the health of Australian mortgage holders. There is in excess of $100 billion, with a B, not an M, $100 billion in cash tied up in our households in mortgage offset accounts and redraws. Where's that come from? Consistently electing to pay more than what we need to, either directly off our mortgage by way of an increased repayment or putting it into a separate account known as an offset facility. So we've also got households that have got more equity in their home than they could ever could have imagined, legacy of what's happened with property markets in the last 2 years. So we've got the strongest household finances in my 50 years on this planet. We officially have the strongest economy we've had in those 50 years. The full house sign is up, Jaden, with our economy. Doesn't matter what industry you work in, there are tens and tens of thousands of jobs advertised right now that can't be filled because the people aren't there to fill it. These are really, really good conditions. Interest rates doesn't change that. And the most important thing, as if that's not enough positive stuff, the most important thing is housing supply. And what is housing? It's shelter. It's an essential commodity. Whether we're in a global health pandemic or whether we're in a rising interest rate cycle, we always need it. And it will be the thing we hang on to keep the most, the roof over our head. So what we've got is an all-time record low number of properties listed for sale and an all-time record low number of properties available for rent. Officially, not an opinion, evidence-based statement. So we will have less buyers because they're spooked. But we don't need anywhere near as many buyers as what Australia would typically see in real estate to cause pressure, because there's much fewer properties on the market either to buy and there's nothing to rent, nothing at all anywhere. So some of those people who come out of lease will become property buyers because either the owner says, I'm not going to renew the lease for you, or I'm going to sell it. Or the tenant themselves say, oh, I don't want to pay that extra $100 a week, even though the market says that you can afford to charge that now. I'm not paying that. I'm going to, now bite the bullet and buy the property myself. So the dire shortage of housing supply, with the exception of Sydney and Melbourne, they're back to an equilibrium stage of housing supply. But everywhere else in Australia, there's nothing available. So that will underpin things. This is what I think will happen. Over the next, let's call it 12 months, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think the RBA will continue the trend that they've shown in the last 2 months, and that's great. We should be applauding the fact that our economy is so strong that the RBA says we've now got confidence to get the interest rates back up to a reasonable level. Why are they doing it? That's the question we should be asking. They're doing it as it's a responsible decision. If there is another major moment of adversity, as happens roughly every 10 years. Recently was the global health pandemic. A decade before that, it was a GFC. Decade before that, it was a national recession. There's always something that pops up. if you've got an interest rate at zero, you've lost a major economic tool to recover your economy. So we're always going to increase interest rates as soon as it was safe to do so that we're back to a normal level for whenever that next moment of adversity be. And that might be 10 years, who knows? But the fact that the RBA is doing it now, we should be going, that's sensible, that makes us even safer, makes our economy safer, our jobs safer, the value of our assets safer. So I reckon that they will get that back to a level similar to where it was 3 years ago as quick as they can. Let's say it takes 12 months. I don't know. They don't know that themselves, but let's say it takes 12 months. Once that settles down, the people who are currently spooked for no reason at all, the people who are currently spooked, they'll sort of go, oh, yeah, what was I worried about? The same as they were when JobKeeper was scrapped, a loan deferrals were scrapped, and the international border was scrapped. They'll sort of go, oh, I've got this evidence. The world didn't fall apart. Oh, I've got a bit of equity in my house, and I'm easily affording my mortgage repayment. So then we'll start to see a return of buyers. When that happens, they will be immediately confronted with what's already there now. Very, very little for sale and for rent. So in a very short period of time, we could be back to significant pressure in markets. The smart people will be processing things not based on what they're reading on their device. They'll be processing things logically, and then they'll be considering all of the factors, and they'll be going, yeah, that makes sense. And if they can afford to buy now, they should be buying now. Because when the others overcome their spook, they will be back transacting, and what's that going to do to asset values? Up she goes. So the biggest beneficiaries will be the ones who are composed now, not the spooks. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Like, especially, I guess, with your comments on supply and demand, and like seeing, and it's been obviously it's been put in the media a lot about construction costs, not being able to build and sort of replace. Like, what would be your leading indicators? If I guess like the other fear with people is, from what I've heard, is like some pretty crazy stuff from the extreme of we could be like Ireland with completely the bottom fall out of the market to like, oh, it looks like concerns about it could be like America, the GFC there. How is Australia sort of fundamentally different from some of those markets? And I guess alluding to some of your stuff on the supply and demand side of things before, where it would be pretty unlikely for something of that nature, that gravity to happen here.
The people who make those comments are not property market experts. They see property as similar to shares, and there are always going to be some things that are just as important to both asset classes. But one of the key things that will always be very different to property and shares is property is not a tradable commodity. You and I can jump onto copious amounts of share-related websites right now and literally press a button and buy or sell stocks. You cannot do that with property. It is not a tradable asset. It's not something you buy one day and sell the next. It's a home. And people do buy and sell homes, but they do not do it in minutes, hours, days, weeks. It's a decision that's made over months. And whatever's happening in the world, like whether you're positive about it or negative about it, people don't just wake up and go, I'm going to sell because I'm worried what's going to happen. Because where's the roof coming from? Over their head. To answer your question, like in regards to other countries and comparing to Australia, well, each of our 8 capital cities are very different to each other, let alone comparing Australia as a country to each other country. Each of our 200 regions are all incredibly different. So it is not one property market. The media often imply it's one property market, that we're all doing the same thing at the same time. Never is. I used some examples before. Sydney and Melbourne, 2017 to 2019. One lost 10% over that 2-year period of time. One lost 15%. The rest of Australia didn't, though. And plenty of parts of Australia had double-digit growth. Right here, right now, for the foreseeable future, because of their fundamentals, nothing to do with the US or nothing to do with interest rates, largely because of their economy in Sydney and Melbourne. They've lost tens of thousands of jobs during the COVID lockdown. Melbourne alone had a decline in population of 60,000 people in 1 year. It normally adds 110,000 people a year. It lost 60 It's never lost 100 people in a year before, let alone 60,000 in a year. Right? But that scenario is not mirrored across the rest of the country. And again, I'll emphasise one of my points earlier because it's critically important for people to try to understand this. Supply. Real estate is not a tradable commodity. It is an essential commodity known as housing. Do whatever you want to it, but people will always need it, and we don't have enough of it.
Yeah, and it looks like there's not going to be any sort of, any big supply hitting the market in sight with, issues of logistics overseas and even labor coming in. With the Sydney and Melbourne markets, like obviously they're pretty dependent on, international migration. Do you see that helping potentially underpin their markets moving forward when we get back to, 150, 200,000 people coming into Australia once that kind of resumes over the next year or two?
Well, the fact we've had officially a net decline in overseas migration over the last 2 years, and we've just recently opened up the international border, so that's a positive thing. I don't expect it's going to be immediate floodgates type stuff, and we'll get to roughly 200,000 net overseas migrants per year in this calendar year. I don't expect it will happen as quick as that, but the reality is instead of losing people to overseas migration per year, we'll gain them. I think it's foolish for anyone to assume that Sydney and Melbourne will always get such a big slice of the overseas migration pie that they got before. Yes, they'll always have a bigger profile than other parts of Australia, but at the end of the day, those people migrating are no different to you or I. You still need to earn an income, and they're always going to be heavily influenced by, well, where's the best prospects for me to get a job? Not saying they won't get a job in Sydney or Melbourne, but the economies are significantly better in other parts of Australia than Sydney and Melbourne, significantly better, and even more so outside of our capital cities. I'm not saying all regions are the same because, even our capital cities are very different, but the absolute best economies and the absolute best property markets are among our 200 regions, not among our 8 capital cities.
Yeah, wow. And do you see, because I know like a focus of your research is on some of the regions and you've done some writing on that lately. Do you see the regions being able to continue to grow, like as people start to have to go back to the office? There was that whole migration from the cities to there. What does it look like post-pandemic in those areas? Like, is there still room for growth?
Oh, absolutely. Every single year, and this statement will surprise people, Jaden, but every single year, bar none, the best performed property markets are among the regions, not among the capitals. Every single year. That's a statistical fact. And mainly because of the mathematical odds. There are only 8 capital cities. You and I don't determine that. There are only 8. There are 200 individual regional towns. Well, there are actually 400 in total, but there are 200 ones what I call substance. They've got a sustainable economy and they've got 10,000 people or more that live there. 200 of them. So basic odds. Picture 2 cups. You've got 8 marbles in one cup and you've got 200 in the other. Which one's going to roll the fastest down the hill? The odds are it will be among that cup that's got 200 in it. But they'll all perform very, very differently this year and every other year. Specific to internal migration, for as far back as the ABS have been tracking population trends for internal migration, which is an existing Australian moving from one city to another, they've been tracking that statistic for 20 years. Every single year of those 20 years, there's been more people leave our capital cities to relocate to a region than go in the other direction. Every single year. All COVID has done is, I guess, accelerated a trend that's been there for at least 20 years that they've been keeping that data. Now, some people have done that relocation because they lived in Melbourne or Sydney, for example, and were in lockdowns longer than what they liked, and said, I'm not hanging around for the next one, and have moved. Others have embraced the work from home thing. And it's sort of gone, I've never done this before, but now that I've done it, I really enjoy it. I'm more productive. I've got more time in my day because I'm not caught up in public transport, etc. I'm not as stressed. If they've adopted that, it means that they can then work from anywhere. So some people who've adopted the work from home are still living in the same home, but with a much improved lifestyle than what they had before. Others have gone that next step. Or some of are living in the same city, but they've upgraded their house. They've taken advantage of the equity and the really strong household finances that we were talking about earlier, and they'll continue to do this for quite some time yet, I believe, Jaden. And others have gone, I'll make up a scenario. I live in Brisbane and I've always wanted to retire, you know, in Noosa or Byron Bay or Cairns or wherever. That was their idyllic dream. And if they've embraced the work from home way of living, they're sort of gone, well, I can do that now. I'm not retired yet, but my tool of trade is my laptop. So I can earn my income from literally anywhere. And off they go, and they've done it. Now, when they do that, that's what we call a transference of housing demand. No one's been born, or we haven't got someone coming from overseas. It's the same residents. They're not adding or subtracting to a national population, but their own individual demand from housing is moving from city A to city B. Not only when they move are they becoming a buyer in that city B and putting upward pressure by creating extra competition there, they're taking their income with them. So their pay packet, they're now spending in City B rather than City A. So all those local businesses in City B is now a beneficiary of that 100 grand a year income or 200 grand a year income, whatever it is. And the cities they've moved away from, of which has happened a lot in Sydney and Melbourne, they've lost that accumulation of all those people that have moved away.
No, and I'll definitely include a link below. You've got some good commentary there on some specific markets as well. Tassie and a couple of regional areas that I think is definitely worth looking into if you're looking at investing. Because it's some good commentary there. But I guess, again, on the general market, one thing we do get a bit is people saying, I'm going to wait for the dip, or I'm going to wait for the market to come off. So I guess, what are your thoughts or advice, especially like a lot of your research where you kind of zoom out and you'll take like a 50-year view and look at all the different events. But, as far as timing the market, is now the right time? Like, how do you, what do you answer to that?
Yeah, well, no, you never know when the dip is until it's way back in the rear vision mirror, because property data, there's usually about a 6-month lag on it. So that's a waste of time. Look, the people that have those questions, I'm a professional property investor. It's what I do all day, every day. And I certainly don't do that, sit around and waiting for a dip. The dip doesn't happen very often. Not saying that property prices don't go backwards. We all know that they do. But they don't go backwards all that often. They're more likely to have periods where they don't show much growth, but so they don't go backwards very often. And just because the market's gone backwards, it doesn't. Property markets aren't tennis balls, so they don't have this sharp bounce. So it's all well and good for someone to go, I think I've found the dip. It's been falling by 5% or whatever over the last 12-month period, and it appears to have stopped. Well, have you ever heard of a city called Perth? Their 4th biggest city. Brisbane didn't do much better. Just largely goes sideways for a long period of time. So if you can afford to invest, it is always a good time to do so. The question about timing is never about when. If you can afford to invest in your future, do it, because no one's going to do it for you. The question is always where. 8 capital cities, 200 regions. I can absolutely guarantee you that every single year there will always be multiple markets somewhere in Australia that have a really healthy outlook. So the important question is to learn, how do I find that information to objectively evaluate, which markets have the best outlook? If you can afford to invest now, do it now. The question is where to do it. If you're a property investor, we advise all our clients to see yourself as being completely borderless. Don't be the creature of habit like everybody else. Everyone's got to live somewhere, but where you live should have no bearing at all on where you invest. In fact, I practice what I preach. I live in Brisbane. So even if the outlook for Brisbane is healthy, Brisbane is the last place that I personally will consider investing, because I believe in that don't place all your eggs in the one basket. So at some point down the track, Brisbane or any location has a period of sufferance, whether it's a significant downturn like we were talking about Sydney and Melbourne earlier, or whether it's just a prolonged period of time of not much growth at all. If you've got all the eggs in the one basket, you're exposed to that disappointment. So think more like a share investor. The share investor who's already got some Commonwealth Bank stocks and some ANZ stocks, next time they can afford to invest, they don't invest in ANZ or Westpac, even if those two companies have the best outlook, because that's creating an unhealthy exposure in the one industry sector. So see yourself as borderless, disregard where you live, and all other emotional things like the weather and is it warm, is it cold, is it coastal, is it inland? That's all window dressing. It has nothing to do with property market performance. The key information is local economic conditions. A town or city, no matter where it is in Australia, if it has a significantly improved economy in, say, 5 years' time compared to today, I promise you its property market will do exceptionally well, particularly if it's got a controlled housing supply pipeline.
And I guess that's probably a good point to, probably give a bit more information. That's obviously what your business Propertyology does, helps us buyers agents and obviously does a lot of research. So, I guess as a bit of a wrap up, tell us a bit more about that and how everyone can find you as well.
I guess to use an analogy, Jaden, think of us as the property investor's equivalent of a stockbroker. It's irrelevant that I live in Brisbane. My market's not Brisbane. My market is 8 capital cities and 200 regions. It's irrelevant where I live and where my clients live. Our clients live all over Australia, many live overseas. So first and foremost, we are national property market analysts. We don't have a vested interest or a bias towards any town or city in Australia. We're open-minded to all of it, and our job is to use the best quality information and to make objective assessments about the outlook of markets. When someone engages their services, we then consider their current situation, where do they live, do they own a home there, do they have investments already, which part of Australia are those properties located in, and then we provide professional guidance on which other locations have, I guess, that good combination of a good outlook, but also in a location that's going to complement their own portfolio as opposed to create a concentration risk within their portfolio. Yes, that's what we do. We buy property for a living, but in a more sophisticated way.
Yeah. So I'll include links below, and there's a bunch of case studies on the website as well to show some examples of the types of people you've helped in the past, and so the types of properties that you looked at. So Simon, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Anytime, Jaden.